So, we are going to say the Serenity Prayer together now. Should be on the screen. Anybody have it memorized yet? We've been going to memorize it during Lent. Okay, 3 of you, 4 maybe. Okay, so keep working at it, and let's pray together. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. So these last weeks we have kind of marched our way through the Serenity Prayer. And tonight we're going to talk about the very last couple of lines, which I think are very cool lines that kind of bring the Serenity Prayer together, so that I might be reasonably happy in this life. We're going to talk about reasonably happy for a little while. Doesn't that sound exciting? And I may be what? Supremely happy in the next life. And so we're going to talk about those two things tonight. And I found a couple of little things about happiness. So a young child says, my teacher gave us an assignment, and one of the questions was, what do you want to be when you grow up? I answered, happy. The teacher said, I didn't understand the test. I said to her that she didn't understand life. Pretty good, huh? Some people bring happiness wherever they go. You bring happiness whenever you go. Now, and I have two quotes. They're going to be on the screen. First one is from Henry Youngman. Some of you are way too young to know who that is, but that's okay. It says, a man doesn't know what real happiness is until he's married, then it's too late. It's not very funny. And then George Burns, happiness is having a large, loving, caring, close-knit family in another city. Yep. All right, so we are going to start with a question tonight, and if you would like to answer it, Flint and Scott, it looks like, are going to be running the mics. And I hope a couple of you are able to answer it and get us started, because I think it's an important question. How have you struggled with unrealistic expectations of happiness? So think about that for a second. How have you struggled with unrealistic expectations of happiness? Scott over there, Missy has her hand up.
All right, well, last week I had said, taking the sinful world as it was, and I'd said, well, sometimes I have an idea of what I want people to do and they don't do it, and so that was my kind of taking the world as it is instead of as I was had of it. And so kind of this same thing goes with unrealistic expectations. I have an idea of what I would do, and when other people don't do it the way I would do it, then my expectations aren't met and I get frustrated, and I just have to learn that other people have different ideas and they can do it their own way, and that's fine too, and just to not expect everyone to think just like I think and do things just the way I do them. So unrealistic expectations, just to learn to appreciate other people's viewpoints more.
Their uniqueness, right? Yeah, very good. Thank you, Missy. Anybody else willing to share? That was excellent. All right, Gary?
I'll give it a go. I'm Gary. I was thinking of the times when I was younger and I had made some accomplishments in sports. And then later on in life, a lot of these other little accomplishments like getting a job and moving up in a job and still feeling there's something wrong. And I can still have that same feeling. And that's why I need to stay vigilant and active in some spirituality issues that always need to be addressed in my life.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Good evening. I think for my expectations would have been in active using. That's what I thought would make me happy, or excess spending. I have a shopping problem now as I got in recovery, and sometimes I think that makes me happy, and then realize, well, that doesn't really make me happy, and drugs and whatever I use didn't really make me happy either. So what I found happiness is in recovery and doing the right thing.
Thank you. Aurora? Anybody else want to share? All right, Christy, right here, right behind you again, Scott.
Hi, I'm Christy. Ever since I got into recovery, well, even before, I had amazing expectations of myself. But in recovery and in my journey through spirituality and life, my expectations, I've always put them so high. You know, I was going to be the best at the steps. I was going to be the best at the commandments. I was going to be the best at this. And I had to learn to get humble. And I had to learn to get ears to listen and a soul and a heart to listen. And once I started doing that and got the listening part down to some degree, life became much easier. And my unrealistic expectations today often are based out of my powerlessness and unwillingness to accept that.
Very good, Christy. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for sharing. And if you come to our group afterwards, that's what we're going to discuss. You know, I think that one of the things I've tried to share over these last few Wednesday nights is that in many ways the Serenity Prayer has a profound building upon itself. And so I just want to point that out again tonight as we get started, because, you know, the Serenity Prayer starts by saying, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And if you are part of maybe a recovery group, that might be all of the prayer that you say on a regular basis. And yet one can stop there and wonder, well, how do you do that? I mean, that sounds good, but it's a little more complicated. So how do you do it? And what I've tried to share is that in many ways, as the Serenity Prayer goes on, it really explains in many ways how that gets done. Well, it gets done living one day at a time, and it gets done enjoying one moment at a time. I was thinking about that this morning. I was at the gym, and on Wednesday mornings, I do this stair climber thing. It's actually this big machine where the stairs actually move. So there's real stairs, and they just move, and you walk up. And I always say the Serenity Prayer when I'm at the gym. I usually say it over a number of times and kind of think it through line by line. And I came to that line, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time. And I was thinking, I am not enjoying this one bit. And I was thinking, you know, that's really true in life, that there are things that we do, sometimes they might even be good for us, but we may not enjoy them at the time. But yet there may be enjoyment that comes out of it. How does that all work together there? Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time. Well, part of it is accepting that hardship is the pathway to peace, and so we're going to take this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that Jesus will make all things right if I surrender to His will. And so then it comes to this last line, or line or two of the Serenity Prayer that I think is so profound that it's worth just talking about for a few minutes, so that we might be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with Him forever in the next. In many ways, I think that we all deal with a mentality of entitlement. And in many ways, I think we have this idea that we have a right, we are entitled to be happy. And if we're not happy, then it's somebody's fault or something is wrong. And I was thinking about where does that come from? Whoever told us that we are entitled to be happy? It's not in the Bible, I will tell you that. Nowhere in the Bible does it say you have the entitled right to be happy the rest of your life. And so, I was been thinking about where in the world does that come from? And in many ways, I think that what it points to is almost a misguided idea of what life is supposed to be about and what really is going to be the center of a life that is filled with a sense of meaning and purpose. So what is happy? What does reasonably happy even look like? Jesus says, when you've decided to come and be one of my followers, you shouldn't expect to be reasonably happy. You should expect to pick up your cross and follow me. And then he goes on to talk about how things are going to be more difficult if you choose to follow me. Jesus doesn't promise us any sense of happiness. And yet one of the realities of my life is that I find that I am the happiest when I am the closest to Christ in my life. Isn't that interesting how that works? Well, I did a little searching this last week about happiness, and I just want to share a couple of things that I came across that I thought were interesting. First comes from a journal article that my favorite author, John Ortberg, wrote an article on happiness. And he wrote, I decently subscribed to an actual academic peer-reviewed journal called the Journal of Happiness Studies. Positive psychology is the big new trend in social science over the last decade. So all kinds of researchers have decided to explore the northern rather than the southern hemisphere of human emotions. One theme that keeps cropping up is the happiness paradox. And here he quotes something that he came across, and I put the quote on the screen. The more directly one aims to maximize pleasure and avoid pain, the more likely one is to produce a life bereft of depth, meaning, and community. Isn't that interesting? Let me read that one more time. The more directly one aims to maximize pleasure and avoid pain, the more likely one is to produce a life bereft of depth, meaning, and community. One article, he writes, listed 11 separate facets of the happiness paradox. Another explained the principle of indirection. Happiness, by its nature, cannot be obtained by direct pursuit. You have to sneak up on it. Or rather, you have to let it sneak up on you while you're pursuing something more important. Very interesting. Another study that I came across said, in one study, people were asked a number of questions about how much they value happiness and how much they believe it is important to work toward being happy. When in the midst of great stress, people were generally unhappy. For everyone else, the greater emphasis put on happiness, the least successful they were at obtaining it. So in other words, if your goal is to somehow obtain happiness, if that's the thing you are trying to pursue in life, the chances are that you are not going to find it. The more it's a goal and the objective of your life, of your daily life, the less likely that you're going to be happy. It didn't matter how happiness was defined. People putting the greatest emphasis on being happy reported 50% less frequent positive emotions, 35% less satisfaction about their life, 75% more depressive symptoms than people that had their priorities elsewhere. And in case you are shaking your head at this narrow definition of happiness, take note that people that valued happiness the most also reported 15% less psychological well-being. Psychological well-being is a smorgasbord of what is good in life, including self-esteem, positive relations, and other people, meaning and purpose in life, a sense of autonomy and a sense of competence in tracking life's challenges. In sum, the more you value happiness, try to be happy, organize your life around trying to become happy, the less happy you end up. Isn't that interesting? So I was thinking, so what's up with that? And here's what I think from a biblical and a theological standpoint. It's not that we shouldn't want to be happy. And it's not that the goal of happiness is like too big for us to try to strive for. It's that it's too small. That if the goal of your life is to somehow be happy, you've set your standards way too low. And if you read the Bible, what you discover is that the way that God would have us set the goals and the objectives of our life is not so much about pleasure and our needs being met, but upon investing ourselves in something that's bigger than ourselves. That if you want a goal for your life, set it on something that's going to give you meaning and purpose. And set your vision upon something that is larger than you. And what you will find is your life is enriched. So it's kind of funny, what the studies say is that when your objective is to try to grasp happiness, it's elusive and it always gets away. But when you set your goal on something bigger, something larger, something that's going to give meaning and purpose, something that's going to make a difference in the world, happiness kind of sneaks back and it finds you. And so one of the things I want to share with you is that if you are a follower of Jesus, learn from, people like Paul, who have come to this great sense of serenity in life. Remember, peace is the absence of chaos and conflict. Serenity is inner well-being, even in the midst of conflict or chaos. And so if you look at Paul, you find that he discovered that. Turn with me in the Bible to Philippians chapter 4, page 985. Philippians chapter 4, in our church Bibles, it's page 985. In a recovery Bible, it'll be on page 1526. Page 985. 985. And I'm going to begin reading at verse 10 of chapter 4. And here Paul writes, "How I praise the Lord that you are concerned about me, about my well-being. I know you have always been concerned for me, but you didn't have the chance to help me. Not that I was ever in need." And here's just one of the most profound lines I think you read in the Bible. "For I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or an empty, with plenty or little. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength." So Paul found this sense of well-being and this sense of serenity and this sense of inner strength and well-being, even in the midst of whether he had lots or whether he had little. One of the mistakes that we make in this life is that we assume that things in this world are going to make us happy. Or that even sometimes we approach the Christian faith in the same way. The Christian gospel, we kind of get confused. We sometimes think that the Christian gospel is that if you accept Christ's forgiveness and grace, then everything will go better on this life and you'll get to go to heaven. But the gospel, according to the New Testament, is that you can actually live with God in a relationship with Him each moment, each hour, every day of the rest of your life. That's the gospel message. That through the forgiveness of Jesus Christ on the cross, you can now live in a relationship with God that begins right now, in this moment, each day, every moment of your life. My experience has been that the further I get away from Jesus in my life, the more that I struggle and I'm robbed of happiness. The closer I get to Jesus, I find a sense of peace and well-being, but also a sense of meaning and purpose that even though I'm not necessarily looking for happiness, it seems to find me. Reasonable happiness is coming to a place of serenity that I'm okay regardless of what's going on. And reasonable happiness is coming to a place in life where you begin to realize that what you thought was the true meaning of life and the true things that will bring happiness are really misguiding you and actually maybe leaving you hungrier than you were before. So I thought of just a few things that I wanted to share before I just say a couple of words about the last line in the Serenity Prayer. Number one, if you're thinking about reasonable happiness, stop comparing yourself to other people. And we all know that. But it's really, we just need to be reminded because we do it all the time. You mentioned it with the job thing. I mean, we always think that there's the perfect job. Somebody else has the perfect job. I don't have the perfect job. Or, somebody else has the perfect house or the perfect family. You know what? Everybody has stuff that we don't know about. Everybody has things going on that we don't know about. Stop comparing yourself to others. Number two, pursue significance by investing in yourself in something bigger than yourself. Number three, let the Lord's will shape your actions in order to reduce self-inflicted unhappiness. A lot of our unhappiness is self-inflicted, whether it's too high of expectations or behaviors we struggle with. And finally, learn to appreciate the small things. And you can only do that if you slow down. That was probably the biggest revelation that I had in my journey of the last 5 or 6 years. Right now at this stage of my life, I am almost as busy as I ever was in my previous life. Things at the church have really been hopping and lots is going on. And I find that I'm just as busy pretty much as I used to be. Some differences, but I'm pretty much busy from morning till night. But I feel like I'm in such a different place. And one of the things that kind of walking through struggles and difficulties in life and then having to rearrange your life around different principles. And one of the things that's taught me is to slow down and take time to connect with God and take some time to appreciate things that I rarely noticed before. And I think that one of the things that we often do is we rush so fast that we don't often take the time to maybe have a little bit of conversation with somebody and enjoy the moment with them. I had one of those incidences this morning. So I'm at my office at Caribou, and there's a new manager at my office at Caribou. I didn't hire him, but he's a nice guy. And I got a cup of coffee, and it happened to be French roast today. And in my old life, I think I would have ordered a cup of coffee and got my coffee and sat down. done my work. Probably wouldn't have even been in a coffee shop, but now I take time and be in a coffee shop and I engage in conversation. And so he's a very chatty kind of guy. And so I said, you got French roast today. French roast is my favorite coffee. And I said, French roast is my favorite coffee. And he said, really? Do you know the story of French roast? And I said, I do not, but I bet I'm about ready to find out. And he said, well, the story of French roast is that early on in the United States of America, the only coffee that came to the country was from England. And they would bring it over in ships, and it would be in the hull of the ship. And oftentimes they would get water in there, and the beans would turn moldy because they would get wet. And he said they would unload those beans, and they decided that they didn't want to waste them, so they roasted them, they burnt them in order to get rid of the mold so that they could still use the coffee beans. And that's why if you like French roast coffee, like actually I have in my cup right now, it has kind of a burnt, little sharper taste to it. That's the kind of coffee I like. And I sat down, and then I told somebody a little bit later, I said, you want to learn about French roast coffee? And see, and I don't know that I would have taken the time to do that earlier in my life. And one of the things that I've just learned to do is I've learned to slow down and engage people in their stories. And it has enriched my life, and it's brought me more happiness than I could ever find in things or in other successes. And it's brought great joy. So we do these things in order that we might be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with God in the next. It's getting a little bit late. One of the passages that is my favorite in the Bible comes from Revelation chapter 21. So instead of having you look it up, I'm just going to tell you about it. In Revelation chapter 21, the Apostle John is given this vision of what heaven is going to be like. It's how the Bible ends. It's a beautiful vision. Chapters 21 and 22 are beautiful visions of heaven. And he says that it's like this new Jerusalem. He saw this new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And he said, in that new place that God is preparing for us, there's going to be... It's not that we know that much about what it's going to be like. What we know is what it's not going to be like. So for he says there's not going to be any more pain there. There's not going to be any more struggles there. No more tears. No more death. No more mourning. No more pain. And it's this incredible vision. And one of the things that this serenity prayer reminds me of, every time I pray it, I'm reminded that no matter how difficult things get in this life, I've got an eternity in a time that will be much better. And nobody can take that away from me. My dad, I was thinking today about my father. He passed away a little over 10 years ago, and he died of pancreatic cancer. And he went downhill pretty fast after he was diagnosed. And I won't tell you the whole story, but because they lived in Bismarck and we lived in Fargo, we weren't able to see him all that often. And we didn't get to go home very often, but he had just been put on hospice, and we had young kids, and because our son had something going on in Bismarck one weekend. So we took the opportunity to go home a little early so that we could see my dad, because we hadn't seen him, and the cancer was really progressing pretty fast. And we drove home, and it's kind of the amazing way that God works. Some of you have heard this story, so you'll have to bear with me for a moment, but we're getting close to Bismarck, and it's evening time, and it's getting a little dark out, and we're kind of thinking, maybe we should just go and stay at Beth's parents', my in-laws' house, because Dad's probably sleeping. He'd just been put on hospice that day, and he was not doing well. And the closer we got to Bismarck, the more I kind of thought, something just says we should stop. And we happened to stop at my parents' condo, and we got to visit with my dad. He was actually awake and lucid, weighed like 87 pounds, and my dad was a pretty big guy. I mean, there wasn't much left of him. And it had been a week since we had seen him, and my kids got to see him, and Beth got to see him, and we had a prayer, and we said, "I love you," which was not common words in my house. And we went home, and I just had this security feeling that, how good it was that, we stopped. And the next morning, like at 8 o'clock in the morning, my mom called, and he had died. And we had just this amazing sense of grace that we had been given that night before and been able to stop. So I go to the funeral, and my dad was, he was kind of annoying. And he would just do all these sayings that would kind of, try to get you to engage in conversation. But he would say these statements that either you ignored them or you tried to ask something. Well, the last week before he died, my dad's pastor was there visiting him. It actually might have been the same day he went on hospice. And my dad, this was the kind of thing he would say. The pastor's sitting there, and they're looking at each other, and he says, "Well, it's time to pay the bill." And, if I had been there, I'd have gone, "Oh, Dad, just what are you trying to say?" But he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And my dad said, "Well, you know how you go to a motel and you check in, and then when you check out, it's time to pay the bill." And he said, "It's time to pay the bill." And the pastor told that story at my dad's funeral, and I had this deep sense that I knew all along. My dad knew what was coming, and he knew where he was going, because he had the assurance that though this life was going to have some struggles, and though this life was not always going to be easy, that there would come a day when the reasonable happiness would end and the supremely happy would begin with his Lord. And I rejoice not just that my dad has a place where there is no longer any pancreatic cancer, and there's no longer any death or mourning or even tears. Imagine that, no tears in heaven. And I'm not anxious to go. That can be a few years away for me. I will be just fine with that. But when that time comes, I know where I'm going. And I know that it will be a place where some of the things that I've had to battle in this life, self-inflicted things like my own addiction or some of the issues that I've had with depression or struggling with work or relationships or whatever it might be, those things won't exist there. That in that place there is going to be a sense of hope and well-being that we can't even imagine, because God has prepared a new place, a new heaven, a new earth for us. And there He will be, and there we will be with Him through faith in Jesus Christ. And so when you pray this prayer, I want you to hold on to that promise. I mean, we don't talk about this that much in this church because we have like issues today to deal with. So we talk more about today's issues. But one of the things that I think that we can hold on to is this hope that someday those issues that I deal with today, they won't be here anymore. And that lasts forever. That lasts forever. Amen. Let's sing a closing song.